So about 20 years ago, someone recommended I read the Satanic Bible. He said it will make you more successful, more powerful, and that it wasn't what people thought it was at all. And he was right. It's not about the devil. It's not about animal sacrifice. What it is about is going to shock you because it is about the dark side of spirituality, and it's more prevalent in the world today than you can possibly imagine.
Welcome to the Meditate More podcast, where it's all about helping you to meditate more consistently, so you can reap all the incredible magical benefits that meditation can bring to your life today. And here is your host, Manny Mandala.
Hey, and welcome to another episode of the Meditate More podcast. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe because we have some power-packed content for you here. Today we'll talk about the dark side of spirituality, and we'll talk about the religion that makes you God, and we'll finally talk about Satanism. I actually know a man personally who was part of the Church of Satan for a decade of his life. He was a satanic priest, appointed by the high priest at the time, the very founder of the Church of Satan, Anton LaVey himself. And while he has left that mindset far behind, what I learned from him is very important for any spiritual seeker to understand, because the dark side can be found in all spiritual traditions and even in our everyday life. So we have to be on guard. If we walk on the spiritual path, we're on the correct path, but think about it. If you walk the correct path in the wrong direction, even without realizing it, things are not going to end well. So this is something every spiritual seeker desperately needs to understand. By the way, if you haven't listened to the previous episodes yet, I highly recommend you do that first, because they do all build on each other. And otherwise you may ask, what does this have to do with meditation? Today's episode is actually a deep continuation of episode 7. But really today we'll tie together knowledge from almost all episodes so far, but definitely episodes 1, 2, and all the ones from 5 through 7. So my recommendation, listen to them all in order, starting with episode 1, and listen at 1x speed. And if you lay that foundation first with the prerequisite knowledge from the previous episodes, then today's episode will really open your eyes in a big way. I can promise you that. And final point before we get started, the best way to get all the podcast episodes is at meditatemorepodcast.com. That's where you can also find everything else. There are videos and audios to choose from, downloads, transcripts, and all the platforms I'm on. And the best way to learn meditation, in my humble opinion, is of course the Meditate More Challenge. In simple terms, that's the meditation course I wish I'd had when I first got started in Singapore back in 2005, and you can find that at meditatemorechallenge.com. That's all the nuts and bolts, that's all the how-to stuff for your spiritual practice. Or just go to mannymandala.com where you can find everything, the podcast, the challenge, and even more goodies. So that's at mannymandala.com. So with the housekeeping out of the way, we'll get started. And as I said, today's topic is really about the light side and the dark side of spirituality in general, not just about the religion of Satanism. Because just like in Star Wars, where they have the dark side of the Force and the light side of the Force, that's an allegory, because the same is true in real life with the spiritual paths. And most famous religions focus only on the positive expression. Like Christianity focuses on unselfishness and on charity, right? Not in the sense of giving money, but in the sense of loving your neighbor. The highest commandment of Christianity is love. Love thy God. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. The same is true for Buddhism. Buddhism is all about coming out of the ego and developing metta. We talked about that in episode 9. Developing that love for your fellow beings, the positive expression of spirituality. And by the way, as we talked about in episode 4, that's really the same thing. What Buddhists call the ego, Christianity calls selfishness. What Buddhists call metta, Christians call it love. So those are all examples of the path of light, the path of the light side of spirituality. Another example is the Kardecist version of Spiritism that we talked about in episode 6, because at the center of those books is morality. There is a big part in the Spirits book that deals just with natural law. And if you ever go to a Spiritist meeting that follows the Kardecist path, you will see most of these meetings are very focused on doing good in the world, of proactively doing good. So that's the light side of spirituality. But some religions have both a dark and a light expression. Maybe you've heard of black magic before, and that there is such a thing as white magic as well. This often spelled with a CK instead of just the C. That's maybe the most famous example of a double-edged spiritual path. But the same is true for all the mystery traditions, all the esoteric schools, for occultism itself. Most people think that occultism is dark spirituality, but that's actually a misunderstanding, because the word occult doesn't mean evil or witchcraft. It actually comes from the Latin word occultus, and it means hidden. So occult spirituality isn't evil spirituality, it's hidden spirituality. It's censored information about spirituality, censored by the powers that be. In many cases, that was the institutions such as the Roman Church. But most of these occult traditions do have a light version and a dark version. Kabbalah, for example. Many people are confused about Kabbalah. Standard Kabbalah is actually light spirituality and teaches about love, about the path to higher consciousness. But there is a dark version of Kabbalah, and that is called Klipot. Another example of a spiritual path that has both the dark and the light expression is Freemasonry. The dark side of that tradition is basically, in its most harmless form, it's just networking. It's just meeting people to selfishly gain influence and power in the world. So it's completely focused on the material, really. But there is a light side of Masonry. If you properly understand the allegories and the tracing boards that are taught in Masonic teachings, they eventually point to the same truths that we've talked about in the previous episodes. And they're essentially trying to do what Eckhart Tolle talked about. Let's build, like a Mason builds, the new earth, the light version of a new world order without tyranny and control. I'll have to expand a lot more on that topic in some other episode, but first I want to wrap up the examples, the spirituality with a double-edged sword, where one spiritual path can have a dark and a light expression. Another example of that is Spiritism. Many schools of Spiritism also have both a dark and a light side. I'm very familiar with Spiritism in Brazil, so I'm going to give a few examples from there. The most famous ones are Macumba and Umbanda, and they do have a dark and a light side to them. The dark side is often called Linhas de Esquerda, which literally translates to lines of the left. In English, this is known as the left-hand path. And they do what's known as trabalhos feitos, or feitiçaria, which is nothing other than black magic or voodoo, right? That's the Brazilian version of voodoo. And it's specifically used for selfish gains, even at the expense of harming others, and sometimes even with the explicit intention of harming others. For example, to take revenge or to achieve some goal. So, for example, they will do magic spells called separação. That's a magic spell to break up a couple. They will do spells like trabalho para fechar caminhos. That literally means a work done to close paths. So, to create obstacles for some enemy, to cause them job loss or financial ruin, etc., sickness, even prison, even death. And I've seen such things play out in the world. I know a case personally of a friend had a conflict with someone, and he told him, look, don't mess with me, like I can get you in jail. And that's not because he had any connections to police, it's because he was a dark magician. And the conflict escalated, and a couple of weeks later, the guy did end up in prison. Now, I know some people will dismiss that as coincidence, but I would guarantee those people have not made a deep inquiry into this topic and actually attended some of these spiritist meetings and made the experience themselves. However, I will say that Umbanda terreiros, the temples of Umbanda, generally refuse to do harm. They do believe in natural law, they believe in karma, they believe in what they call the lei do retorno, the law of return as they call it, as we know it from episode 1 of the podcast. You reap what you sow, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Why? Because, as it is also put sometimes, as you do unto others, so shall it be done unto you. That's Newton's third law again right there, isn't it? See, karma is really such a simple thing because we've already established in our science that for every action there is an opposite and equal reaction. We just assume it doesn't apply to us. But it does. The universe is a giant mirror, and that's the meaning of karma. Basically, there are laws of nature, many of which science understands already, and spirituality is part of this reality. This reality is not just a physical world, it is a spiritual world as well. Therefore, the laws of this reality are also spiritual laws. And that's where a quote comes to mind from The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, where the priest says, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction in physics and in men. But again, back to the topic of Spiritism and Umbanda and those Brazilian traditions, most Spiritist temples do not condone black magic. But there are some independent practitioners or specific Kimbanda houses where anything goes for a price. Like I said, I've met people like that personally, and there are even Instagram influencers in Brazil who talk about this stuff and who sell this kind of service, who sell black magic online, like some kind of e-commerce product. And that raises an interesting question. Why do they do evil if they know about the law of return? And there are two explanations really. Either they rationalize it by a moral disengagement that we talked about in episode 8, or they do not believe that morality is objective. So they believe that there are consequences for our actions, but they believe that what's really right and wrong is completely subjective, that we get to make that up as we wish, as per episode 1 and 2. But maybe the easiest way to prove that morality is objective is simply this. Because when we take an action, any action in the world, then the results of that action are objective. Something has objectively and factually taken place in the world. And if that action has initiated harm, then that is what we will reap. That is what we sow, so therefore that is what we will reap. We take an action, there is a result, and that result is objective. Did it initiate harm to another sentient being or not? Or as Newton put it, whenever object A exerts a force on object B, then object B simultaneously exerts a force of equal magnitude in opposite direction back on object A. So this applies to us, and it applies to what we do. You can test this real quick. If you press your thumb on your table right now, you will be exerting force on the table, right? And the harder you press, the more pressure you will be exerting on the table. But at the same time, the harder you press, the more pressure you will also feel on your thumb as well, right? So all our behaviors act on the environment and equally back on ourselves. But people either don't believe that, or they don't want to live by this law and they flaunt it, either inadvertently or deliberately. And a lot of people don't believe it because there seems to be no immediate proof, right? Often there is a time delay between what we sow and what we reap. But that shouldn't come as a surprise, because the same is true with literal sowing and reaping. If a farmer plants something, he can't harvest the next day. He can't even harvest the next week or the next month. It takes a long time from nature to do her part. But eventually, if he plants potatoes, he will reap potatoes. If he plants a sweet fruit, he will reap a sweet fruit. And if he plants a bitter fruit, he will reap a bitter fruit. And people with this darker spiritual worldview, they are basically planting the bitter fruit and then they're upset. So one of the reasons why the Buddha is laughing, have you seen the Buddha laughing in some images and statues? It's a famous meme, the laughing Buddha. The reason he's laughing is because as he becomes enlightened, he realizes the cosmic joke. We suffer and we complain about our suffering, but it's really like a child punching himself in the face and then crying that his face hurts. A lot of the time we plant bitter fruit, sour fruit, and then come harvest time, we complain that we don't have any sweet fruit to eat. So really the people who flaunt these laws, who live against these laws, they either don't believe that or they don't want to live by it. They know about these laws, but they don't want to live by them. By the way, in the introduction, I mentioned that I personally know a guy who used to be a priest in the Church of Satan. You can actually look him up online because he is a pretty well-known researcher and podcaster. His name is Mark Passio, and his website is whatonearthishappening.com. And he makes the distinction between Satanism and dark Luciferianism. And he says, by and large, Satanists don't believe in objective morality. They don't believe that there is such a thing as karma or moral laws, that there is no such standard. Whereas dark Luciferians, they tend to know about these laws, but they're upset about the fact that these laws are in place, so they're looking for ways to get around it, to live an immoral life without it coming back to them, by getting other people to do evil for them. In any case, this dark expression of spirituality, that's what Satanism is. So you see, it's not about worshipping the devil. It's about flaunting the moral laws of nature. It's not about transcending the ego. It's refusing that call and embracing the ego. And while we're on this topic, I need to clarify something about the ego. Most people think the ego is the sense of I that needs to be destroyed completely. So we dissolve into some bubble of collective consciousness, like the Borg, or like in that TV show Pluribus. But that's actually a misunderstanding, because it's neither about dissolving the ego completely, because we do have an individual soul, the monad, right? Our individual point of consciousness that observes what is going on, that can even observe our mind. Nor is it about embracing the ego totally and thinking it's all about me, like Satanism teaches. It's really about striking the balance between individualism and collectivism, where I am me and you are you, but we know that we're not truly separate. On a cosmic level, we're one. That's the law of one, that's oneness. And therefore, I can't do harm to you without harming myself, because everything is one. That's why Newton's third law applies to the soul, to the spirit, to our actions. And if I do good for others, that's never at my expense. That's good for me too. Yet at the same time, I'm still me and you're still you, right? So that's balance again. That's the golden middle path that the Buddha talked about. So what is the ego really? And here's one definition I really like, and I've never seen this anywhere else, but I think it's very apt. Ego is the domination of the mind. So we talked about this before. That's when the mind is above consciousness instead of the other way around. And that's the default state of humans, and it has to be flipped. In other words, the mind is running the show, it's on autopilot, and consciousness gets dragged along for the ride, and we need to get it back under control. And this ego, this automatic mind, is also the reason why when we're in ego, when we're in the automatic mind, we are unable to hear truth. As per episode 5, the mind in an unmeditative state distorts, generalizes, and deletes, as NLP teaches, neuro-linguistic programming. And that's why we cannot perceive truth while we're in this state, in this unmeditative, non-present, normal monkey mind state. And without real truth, there is no real morality, because we never know if the morality we believe in is really true. That's why people turn to religions and they say, oh, just tell me what I should do. Give me commandments, give me shilas, right? And that is why to truly be a spiritual being in a conscious evolution, to be a moral being, we need to come out of ego, which means we need to step out of the chattering monkey mind. That's why meditation is so important on the spiritual path. Now, the people on the dark side of spirituality, the left-hand path, the Satanists, the dark Luciferians, they're not interested in transcending the ego. They want to embrace the ego. In fact, in LaVeyan Satanism, the ego is actually God. Isn't that fascinating? Most people think that in Satanism, they worship the devil. That's completely untrue. They worship the self. They elevate the self to godhood. I am God, right? I'm the center of this reality. Therefore, I'm the God of this reality, of my reality. It's a mindset of total self-centeredness, totally lost in that illusion of separation, the opposite of oneness, right? So again, enlightenment leads us to the realization of oneness, that we're all one, that all illusion is ultimately separation. Satanism then is embracing that illusion fully. As I mentioned in the intro also, I came across Satanism almost 20 years ago when a guy I was following at the time recommended to get into it. And he said, as I'm saying, it's not about the devil at all. It's not about any supernatural being. It's more of a self-help philosophy, right? It's just, the devil is just a symbol that represents our desire for indulgence. That's basically the opposite of equanimity, right? That we talked about in episode 9. So he said, Satanism is more of a lifestyle and an ideology that will make you more successful in life. And it's a rebellion against religious dogma that many of us grew up with and which offends logic and reason. So I thought, interesting. I'm open-minded. As we talked about in episode 5, to discover truth, a judge has to hear all witnesses, right? So I read the Satanic Bible about 20 years ago. And to be honest, I didn't think much. I had already found natural law back in 2004, thanks to the works of Allan Kardec, which we talked about in episode 6. Allan Kardec's work really sheds light on all the Christian teachings that seem to be illogical. That's actually the comment I get most frequently. Of all the feedback I get on the podcast, I get the most feedback on episode 6, because these books really make sense of things that are very difficult to understand otherwise. In the words of Allan Kardec, as he puts it himself, he says, unshakable faith is only that which can face reason in all human epochs, right? In other words, science had come a long way when those books were written in the 19th century, and some of the stuff in the Bible didn't really make sense anymore, even in the 19th century, if they're taken literally. But there are rational explanations that can be found in Kardec's work and in episode 6, so check that out if you haven't yet. That's at mannymandala.com/6. Now, let's really take a closer look at Satanism to really understand what's going on, because this is surprisingly important, and you will understand why once we're through with this topic. There are actually various satanic organizations that are different from each other, just like there are many churches, right? There is the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church and the Evangelicals and the Baptists and the Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, and the list goes on. And they have different beliefs as well. And similarly, there are many satanic organizations. There is Anton LaVey's Church of Satan, and they're atheists. They don't believe in God or Satan or demons or other entities. But there's also dark practices that I've seen in Brazil, such as the Brazilian versions of voodoo or the left-hand path Kimbanda that I talked about earlier. They explicitly work with demons and entities. But the Church of Satan believes in the self, the egoic self. That's what they worship, the me, the ego. Then you have, for example, the Satanic Temple. Then there's the Order of Nine Angels, the Greater Church of Lucifer. There's the Temple of Set, a lot of different satanic organizations, just like there are a lot of different churches. Now, the Temple of Set, for example, they reject both conventional belief in God and materialist atheism. They reject both of those, and they say gods other than Set are mental constructs, and Set is a unique source of consciousness. But the point being, there are a lot of different satanic organizations, just like there are a lot of different churches and a lot of different Christian denominations. However, they all share an overarching worldview, right? Just like there is an overarching worldview in Christianity, so is there an overarching worldview in Satanism. Despite the many churches and the many denominations, they all have some concepts in common, such as the Trinity, the resurrection of Christ, the salvation, the authority of the scripture, and so forth. And by the same token, different satanic religions also have certain things in common, a mindset, if you will, a satanic worldview that the vast majority, if not all, Satanists have in common. And there are 4 basic tenets of this worldview. And as I break down the 4 tenets, I want to once again give credit to Mark Passio, the researcher and spiritual teacher who was once a priest in the Church of Satan. He has studied this religion in much greater depth than I ever will. I'm not going to spend 10 years of my life to study Satanism, and I'm not going to become a satanic priest. So to really go in depth, I recommend checking out his work. But he basically breaks it down into 4 basic tenets of Satanism. The first one, the first tenet we already talked about, that's egotism. The way this is worded in the Church of Satan is self-preservation is the highest law. That means taking care of myself and what I want and need is more important than anyone else and what anyone else wants and needs. It's more important than doing right by others. It's more important than doing the moral thing or the right thing. So let that sink in for a minute. Live for yourself. Care only about you and yours. Does that sound familiar maybe? How many people are living that way in the world today? We talked about that in episode 8. How many people have only 2 priorities in life? Priority 1 is making enough money to pay the bills and take care of our immediate family. And priority 2 is have fun. Then the work is done. I have taken care of my financial obligations. Now I'm going to party or travel or go surfing or go watch TV, watch a movie, play a video game, engage in some hobby, whatever it may be. That mindset is literally Satanism. Whether someone is actually a practicing Satanist and attends the Church of Satan or has ever read any satanic texts, that mindset is what Satanism teaches and promotes. Now, we've talked about how the mind creates Maya, creates that illusion of separation, the illusion that is the regular, normal person's perception of the world. Satanism then straight up embraces the illusion, right? If it's all about the lowercase s self, and that self is an illusion, then embracing the ego is embracing illusion. They're inverting what I said in episode 1. When I said we, not me, they invert that to me, not we. And that makes sense because we know that they like to invert things even from their symbols, right? They use the cross, but they use the inverted cross. They use the pentagram, which in itself is not the satanic symbol, but they invert it. And the inverted pentagram is a satanic symbol. They invert gender, they invert good and evil, they invert morality, they invert everything because they literally embrace illusion, because they embrace separateness, and separateness is illusion. In a state of separateness, everything is illusion. Here's an interesting side note. People think that ego means wanting to be right, yes? But that's actually the opposite of ego. If you really want to be right, if you actually want to be right, actually be aligned with truth, then you're starting to come out of illusion, you're starting to come out of ego. You're starting to admit when you were wrong. Instead of insisting on opinions and beliefs, you drop all opinions and beliefs and search for the actual truth. And that's what we talked about in episode 2 and 5. So the ego is wanting to be an illusion, clinging to illusion, insisting on illusion. Whereas once we come out of the ego, when someone tells us something that sounds strange or new or unfamiliar or maybe even wrong based on what we've learned so far, we don't do that knee-jerk response of rejecting it, right? We hear them out. We're now able to start perceiving truth by listening to all the witnesses as the judge in the courtroom that we talked about in episode 5. So let me give you an example. Imagine there are 2 people debating and one of them says 2 + 2 is 4 and the other says, no, 2 + 2 is 5. Now, if they both insist, I am right, you are wrong, are they both in ego? And the answer is no, of course not. If the person who says that 2 + 2 is 4 insists on his opinion, that's not ego. He's standing in truth. So really make sure to check out episode 5 if you haven't yet. You'll get a lot out of that one. But basically, that's the first tenet of the satanic mindset, embracing ego. Now, the second tenet of Satanism, as defined in Passio's work, is moral relativism. And that means that morality is subjective. There are no objective moral standards. Everyone has their own opinion of what's right and wrong. And that means, therefore, it's subjective. Because people have different opinions of what's right and wrong, that proves, therefore, we can conclude that morality is subjective. Of course, that's nonsense. Like, just because people have different opinions on something doesn't necessarily prove that the topic is subjective, because the people could be wrong in their opinions. For example, in Afghanistan, pederasty and child sexual exploitation is a recognized cultural practice in some parts of the country. They have a name for this. It's called bachabazi. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it literally means playing with boys. So does that mean that it's subjective? Sexual exploitation of minors is not wrong. It depends on your perspective. It depends on your culture. Of course not. But moral relativism follows logically if you buy into the first tenet of Satanism. If taking care of myself, of me, is the highest good, the most moral action, then what's moral, what's right is different for everyone. It's subjective, it's relative. right? And that's, of course, the ego, the sense of self as separate from the all, that illusion, that Maya. And the reality you realize with deep spiritual practice, oneness, that we're all one, proves that what's right and what's wrong is the same for everyone. Because what initiates harm to one affects the all negatively, and I'm part of the all, so that includes me. So what helps one, what helps another, affects the all positively, and that includes me. So it is completely objective because everyone is affected the same way by every action. Every harmful action affects everyone in this reality. That's the butterfly effect, the ripple effect. And every positive action affects everyone positively in this reality, and that's what makes it objective. That's why it's the same for everyone. But since they embrace the ego, the illusion in Tenet 1, this has separated them from reality itself, so they cannot perceive reality anymore. They cannot perceive truth, just like they can't perceive oneness. And that leads us to the third tenet, which is social Darwinism. And this, again, follows logically from the first two tenets. Since me is what's most important, and since morality is whatever is good for me, then, well, if I have to step on others to get what I want, so be it. Because this is a dog-eat-dog world, right? You've heard that phrase before. Or some people put it as, this is a world of sheep and wolves. Basically, Satanists see that as a simple choice. Which one are you going to be? Are you going to be a sheep or a wolf? Since there are people in the world who are wolves, who are predators, and there are people who are their victims, you have a choice. Do you want to eat or do you want to be eaten? And if those are the only two choices, then for a Satanist, it's an easy choice that you would rather be a wolf. But of course, that's a dialectic. That's a false choice. There's a third alternative, isn't there? You could neither let yourself be victimized, you could have healthy boundaries, as is often talked about in spiritual circles, and at the same time, never initiate harm to other beings. But that's the satanic ideology. And it's also been stated as might makes right. That means violence is an acceptable way to get whatever I want. By the way, interesting side note here, I listened to the Hardcore History podcasts about Genghis Khan, and you can literally find this kind of stuff in his letters to his enemies as some kind of divine order. He says, I want your stuff, and I have the army powerful enough to take it, so therefore God favors me. And people still think this way today. Today that has morphed into, your country has a lot of oil, looks like it needs some freedom. Right? Now here's something very interesting that a lot of people overlook. It's not just if you're the strongest you have the right to dominate. It's also if you're smart enough to trick other people, you have a right to do that as well. And we see that in the banking system, right? We see that in the money system, we see that in the political system. But in summation, if you can get a benefit while harming others, then that's your superior genes that allow you to do that, and so that's fine. It's just survival of the fittest. It's just the way of nature, like the beasts of the fields. The lion eats the zebra because the lion has more dominant genes, and such is nature. So it's approved by Mother Nature. You have her blessing. And indeed, the Church of Satan teaches, that's one of the teachings you will find in Levian Satanism, is that man is just another animal. But again, that's exactly where their logic falls flat, because obviously we're not just animals. We do have higher consciousness than animals, and we do have the ability to discern right from wrong. And we do have the ability to understand what I talked about in today's episode, which is that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. And what affects you negatively affects the all negatively, affects this reality I live in negatively. And then I have to live in that reality, which is no worse. And that brings me to the fourth and final tenet of the satanic ideology, which is eugenics. And that basically means these most dominant people in society, be it the stronger, the most adaptable, the most ruthless, the most cunning, the people who are strong enough to dominate others or clever enough to trick others, they get to decide who lives and who dies, who reproduces, who gets sterilized. In the Third Reich, this was known as the final solution. Under communism, this is usually handled with gulags. But basically, they can choose who is worthy of living and who is unworthy of life and should be put in camps or euthanized. It basically says that the ruling class can decide which genetic traits do we want to promote, and which people should be sterilized because they have undesirable traits. Undesirable by the ruling class's subjective view, of course. But might makes right, and they have the power, so there will be done, and this is okay, yes? That's what these people actually believe. They're literally playing God on earth. As I mentioned, that's one of the satanic goals. They worship the self as God. They see the self as God on earth. And as I said in the intro, we'll talk about a religion that makes you God. Maybe you've heard that in some New Age circles, that you are actually God. I got bad news for you. You're not God. I'm not God. We're all part of the all, right? We partake in divine consciousness. But the belief, I am literally God, that is one of the satanic beliefs. All right, now we've pointed the finger at those people for long enough, because now comes the heavy part. Now we'll have to take a look at ourselves, and including myself in the past. Because even if we don't belong to any satanic church, these ideas are very prevalent in our society today. The researcher Mark Passio calls this de facto Satanism. That's someone who's not officially a Satanist, but who still might believe in egotism, who's still always thinking me, worship of the self, or as it says in the Satanic Bible, the Satanist believes in complete gratification of his ego. Satanism is in fact the only religion which advocates the intensification or encouragement of the ego. And that's exactly the people we talked about in episode 7, right? Including maybe ourselves. Whenever we think, I don't do any harm, so I'm a good person, but we also don't actively do good, proactively help the suffering of this world. And if we're honest, that's how most people live their lives. As we said, they spend all their time chasing money, they spend all their time paying the bills and then having fun. That's Satanism. In the spiritual community, this is also known as service to self, or STS. I don't care what's going on in the world as long as it doesn't affect me. Now, what about the average person and moral relativism? You'd be shocked, but this also applies to a lot of people, even if they're not members of any of the satanic denominations. According to surveys in the West, about 2/3 to 3/4 of all people do believe that morality is subjective, like the pederasts in Afghanistan with their boy play, I guess. It'd be funny if it wasn't so tragic, isn't it? But obviously, if you really develop metta, if you develop loving kindness, if you develop compassion for other beings, then of course you won't want them to be harmed. There is nothing subjective about this. A mother will always live by the golden rule towards her child. She will never initiate harm towards her child, and she will always help that child when the child is suffering. Why? Because she really has true love for her child. She has developed metta without meditation, just biochemically. Except for a few cases of mental illness, most mothers have an unbelievable amount of love for their children. But unfortunately, most people have not developed this kind of love for all of humanity. So when it comes to determining what's right and what's wrong, the majority of people, 2/3 to 3/4 in recent surveys, think it's completely subjective. There's no objective standard for this whatsoever. Therefore, they just go by man's law, or they go by religion's law, right? We talked about this in episode 1. If you don't know what's right or wrong without having to look it up in a book, then you don't know. You don't know the answer. Like a test in school, you can't cheat on the test. You have to know the answer. You can't take a book and look up what the answer is. You have to know it in your heart. The difference between right and wrong is something that is written on our heart. As soon as we feel love for someone, we will immediately do right by that person. So then the way to really get to an understanding of objective morality is to develop our love for all beings, for all sentient beings, and that's the practice of metta that we talked about in episode 9. In the movie Avatar, they make a scientific study of these indigenous people of that planet and their miraculous connection to the world they live on, to their trees and their plants and to the nature around them, to the animals around them. They find this so fascinating and so bizarre, when really it's the other way around. That's the normal state of a healthy being. What should be studied under a microscope and by scientists is how come we are so disconnected from other beings in our world. Now, what about the third tenet, social Darwinism? Is that prevalent in normal everyday people who aren't even members of a satanic organization? Well, how many people in this world believe that some people have the right to rule other people? We talked about that in episode 8, right? And the final tenet, eugenics, even the fourth tenet has made its way into everyday population. If you have a political conversation with someone, how many people would agree with the statement, there are too many people in the world, it'd be better if we reduce the world population, which by the way is not true. If we lived in ecological harmony with this planet, we could sustain much larger populations. It's just the way we're going about doing things. But even if you don't believe in Tenet 4, even if you don't believe in eugenics, the belief in the other three will create the fourth as an unintended outcome. Because the belief in Tenet 3, in social Darwinism, in the authority of some people over other people, leads to what we talked about in episode 8. 270 million people killed by governments just in the last 100 years. But now, for the most interesting question of all, how many people does this apply to? How many people in this world are actually Satanists? Maybe you've heard on social media or on YouTube and conspiracy videos that the ruling class is satanic. They engage in satanic rituals and there's satanic imagery displayed in major events and media productions like the Olympics, the Coachella Festival, the Grammys, and many other examples. What's the deal with this? Are these coincidences? Is that just art? This is kind of weird. Every barcode has the number 666 in it. You can research that on your own time. Any product you pick up in the supermarket that has a barcode, the number 666 is in there, which is of course a famous satanic number. There's a lot of speculation on the internet. People often say, well, if that was true, someone would come forward. You couldn't keep that a secret. But the thing is, a lot of people have come forward, and there are countless whistleblowers who have talked about how popular Satanism is among the ruling class. Just a few examples are Kathy O'Brien, Jay Parker, Mark Passio himself. And we can talk about that, and maybe we will talk about that in a separate episode, but to be honest, it's kind of besides the point. if our ruling class is satanic or not, because most of our population is satanic. As I've just shown, most of our population lives by the satanic tenets. Whether they actually believe in that religion or read those books or subscribe to that knowingly, that's their lifestyle, that's their ideology on an unconscious level. Even if someone goes to church but has that kind of mindset, they're really a Satanist, not a Christian. Even someone who considers himself a Buddhist could really be a Satanist, like the example I gave in episode 7, right? Even someone who's very nice and kind and pleasant to everyone they meet, they can still be a Satanist in their heart, in their mindsets, in their behavior. In fact, psychopaths are often particularly nice outwardly. So people are Satanists and they don't even realize it. Again, I'm not saying the devil has them or they're going to hell or any such fire and brimstone ideas. I'm saying they hold a worldview that is identical to the satanic religion, to the left-handed spiritual path. So a huge amount of people in our society are actually Satanists, and then we wonder why this world is such a mess. By the way, before I wrap this topic up, I want to encourage you to go a little deeper with this topic, because it is really at the core of so many of the problems we experience in our world and in our society, and not because the ruling class is satanic, but because most people are satanic without realizing it. And the best way to go deeper on that topic is to study the work of Mark Passio. As I mentioned, he's a former satanic priest who has come out of that mindset maybe 20-25 years ago and became a whistleblower and teaches the public about what's really going on with this religion, with this mindset. He discovered 20 years ago that Satanism is not what it seems indeed, but it's also not a quaint little self-help group. And so he dedicated his life to become a whistleblower, to educate the public about what's really going on. I highly recommend you check out his website at whatonearthishappening.com. And I recommend you click on videos and watch all the videos about Satanism and about the dark occult. And then as a second step, click on podcasts and listen to all of those, starting with episode 1. Absolutely crucial information for any spiritual seeker. All right, and now I have a few more very important points. Make sure you stick around for these. But first, if you like this episode, you'll probably like the other ones. So make sure you listen to the archives if you haven't yet. Start with episode 1 and go in order. I honestly think it's going to change your life. You can find that at meditatemorepodcast.com. And if you're into spirituality, you will probably like the Meditate More Challenge. That's my complete meditation course, and it's absolutely free for now. So go check that out at meditatemorechallenge.com. And as of the time of this recording, the podcast doesn't have a big audience yet, but it has an audience of very interesting people. Check this out. I received a really cool email from Dr. Will Tuttle, the author of The World Peace Way, and several other books which you can find on Amazon. And he wrote, "Thanks so much for your 7-day Meditate More challenge. I've really enjoyed it. Like you, I'm a pianist and love meditating. I started in 1975, real veteran." That's my comment. He didn't say I'm a real veteran. And went on a pilgrimage with my younger brother, walking from our home in Concord, Massachusetts, across the country with no money, meditating on Ramana Maharishi's "Who am I?" question, and ended up at a Zen center in Huntsville, Alabama, and then in Tibetan Buddhist and Zen centers in the San Francisco Bay Area, and then as a Zen monk in South Korea. Wow, amazing journey. He writes, "Haven't missed a day of meditation in 51 years. It's the absolute greatest and most important dimension of life. And I talk about it in my books and lectures and workshops constantly. Your approach is fantastic, simple, direct, enthusiastic, and accurate." So thanks again for that, Will. If you're listening, that email made my day, and so I wanted to share it. A very powerful story. And subscribe to the podcast, of course, because soon we'll be talking about collective manifestation. We already talked about the law of attraction and how you can manifest your goals, how you can achieve what you want in life using visualization, manifestation, the law of attraction. Soon we're going to talk about collective manifestation, how this collective world, this reality we all share, is actually manifested. We'll talk about reincarnation, we'll talk about the soul's mission here on Earth, and much, much more. So all that's coming up in the next episodes of the Meditate More podcast. Subscribe if you want to be notified when the next episode is ready. And the best way to subscribe is to hit the big yellow button on my website, meditatemore.com. So thanks so much for listening. I'm Manny Mandala, and I'll see you on the next episode. So make sure to subscribe to the podcast now. And special thanks to Mariano Rogin and Lex van Zomeren for providing some of their music for the podcast. Thank you for the music, guys. I really appreciate it. And remember to meditate more, meditate more, meditate more, because it is so, so worth it.